I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Maggie Drummond-Ball. I'm the Director of Philanthropy at the Maine Community Foundation. Just really nice to see all of you today, and on such a dreary day, it's nice for us to be together, all these sunny faces. And before we get started, I just want to ask my co-hosts today to quickly introduce themselves. So you probably know all of them or most of them, but just want you to see their faces on the screen. Would you like to go first, Anne?
Okay.
Sure.
No, I just logged. Yeah, I'm on me. I just logged in. I forgot. I'm sitting here talking.
Thank you. It'd be great if people would keep themselves on mute. I'm Ann Ball, Program Director at the Maine Downtown Center at Maine Development Foundation, and I'm really happy to be here with everyone today.
Great. Thanks, Anne. And Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Trice. I'm the coordinator for Maine Accelerates Growth, which is the network of organizations supporting scalable and growth-based entrepreneurs in Maine. And happy to see most of you. Many of you are already part of that network, and I'll give more information for those who want to join. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And Martha?
Hi, everybody. Martha Bentley with the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development, and have been along for this ecosystem ride for quite a while. So really happy to see this big group today.
Great. Thanks, Martha. So again, if you're just joining us, we ask you to check in the chat and let us know what prompted you to join the meeting today, accept the invitation to join this conversation. And again, I'm Maggie Drummond-Ball from the Maine Community Foundation. And we just have 90 minutes together today, and we know it's going to go fast. So that's why we're not having everyone do their introductions, but we do encourage you to use the chat as much as possible. And I think it's safe to say, I speak for all of us when I say that we're really proud of this amazing entrepreneurial ecosystem that we're lucky enough to have in Maine. And the depth and breadth of our organizations is truly impressive for a relatively small, well, not even relatively, just very rural state. And we have a deep bench of organizations and programs and individuals that all have a role in supporting entrepreneurship and innovation in our state. And we're just really lucky to have each other in this network. So in today's meeting, we have over 70 people registered, at least 6 educational and research institutions. We have people joining us from Rockland, Belfast, Lewiston, Mount Desert, Ellsworth, Biddeford, Presque Isle, Portland, Millinocket, Skowhegan, Machias, Monson. I know there are more. Those are the ones that I jotted down from our registration list. We have multiple CDFIs and funders, several state and federal government offices represented with us today, and just dozens of nonprofit organizations and collaborative workspaces, many of which focus on some of the most underserved entrepreneurs and innovators that we have here in Maine. And we do our work in many different ways. So some of us focus locally, some regionally, some statewide, some nationally or globally. And we focus on particular types of entrepreneurs or specific sectors, or on businesses that are at particular stages of their growth and development. And we have all various levels of connection with and knowledge about one another. I'm sure as you look around in this meeting, there are some you know better than others, and some you talk to every day, and others who will be new to you. We have several collaborative networks. We've heard some of them mentioned already: Maine Accelerates Growth, the Down East Innovation Network, Upstart Maine, Startup Maine. We have all of the corners covered. And we're all part of this ecosystem. We're all in this together, and we all have a particular role to play. And that role might change from day to day. And the purpose of our conversation today is really to explore the ways that we knit it all together and to understand and capitalize on each other's strengths, identify and respond to gaps, and really continue to lean into the work that makes our ecosystem more equitable and more inclusive. And I'll just mention, if you haven't seen it yet, the series of recent articles that Karem Durdag did for the Maine Startup Insider is really great. So given all of that, there are 2 key themes for our conversation today. The first is really just building and strengthening the connections between our place-based, community level ecosystem building and our statewide and regional networks and resources. And the second theme is just about centering equity and inclusion in all the levels of the work that we do individually and collectively. So we'll explore these themes in two ways. The first is through our guest speaker, sharing learning from the Kauffman Foundation and sharing their experience supporting ecosystem building and stories from other places that might be of interest to us or instructive for us. And we'll meet him in just a moment. And the second part of the way that we'll explore these themes is through small group conversations with one another. So we've built in time for discussion and questions with Andy after this first part of the meeting. And then we'll also have time to reflect as a large group once we've had conversations in our small groups. So though we don't have as much time as we probably need or would like today, we are trying to build in as much time as possible to keep the conversation moving and get lots of ideas out on the table. So with that, I will turn it over to Martha to introduce our guest today.
Thanks, Maggie. I have the distinct honor today of introducing my friend, Andy, to this group here in Maine. I first met Andy in Fargo, North Dakota, of all places. It was at the Startup Champions Network Summit, a regular meeting of entrepreneurial ecosystem builders from smaller towns and more rural settings. And Andy was leading a very difficult conversation about our startup ecosystems often not being very diverse, inclusive, or equitable. The conversations got very heated and very uncomfortable, and Andy just leaned into the discomfort, which makes him perfect for sharing his thoughts with us today. Andy cut his teeth at ecosystem building as an on-the-ground ecosystem builder in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His leadership roles included founder of the New Bohemian Innovation Collaborative, the New BOCO, an initiative making Iowa more resilient to a changing economy by supporting entrepreneurship, innovation, and tech education. Andy comes to us today, however, from the Kauffman Foundation, well known to all of you as one of the premier funders and thought-leading philanthropies around entrepreneurship. Andy joined the Kauffman Foundation team in 2016 and is the Senior Program Officer for Ecosystem Development. Andy is a sought-after speaker and has provided inspiration and ideas to audiences at over 50 colleges and universities, in addition to many other professional settings. Andy, we are thrilled to have you spend some time with us this afternoon, and welcome back virtually to Maine.
For having me and everyone on the call. I will say, Martha, you and I didn't meet in Fargo, but the first time I saw your work, I was visiting Portland during Maine Startup and Create Week, and we learned a ton just hanging out, watching all of that and how that unfolded. So the admiration is mutual. Thanks for inviting me today. I'm going to share some thoughts around entrepreneurial ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystem building. If you're on the wrong Zoom meeting now, now's a good time to, if you need to check out. But if you're here for the entrepreneurial ecosystem building talk, I'm so excited that you are here. I will be first to say that I am not an expert in this category because there are no experts in this category. It's very much an emerging practice. So my guess and my hunch is that there are people on this Zoom call that are going to have more insights and thoughts into this than what I have. The purpose here of my remarks is not to be the definitive answers of how this is supposed to work, but actually to spark a conversation on the second half of this gathering, which I actually think is going to be way more interesting, and I'm going to learn as much as I'm sharing right now. Before I get started, I ask a couple of questions. How many in the group, is anybody in the group, by show of hands, an entrepreneur or has been an entrepreneur, thinks of themselves as entrepreneurs? Good, we have some entrepreneurs in the room. How many people in here on a day-to-day basis, you spend your days face-to-face with entrepreneurs or Zoom to Zoom with entrepreneurs where you directly serve entrepreneurs? Okay, that's pretty good. And then how many people here have ever referred to themselves as an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder or some related term? Raise your hand. Okay. So less than a quarter, less than 30%. Okay, my goal by the end of this is for you all to be able to feel comfortable referring to yourself in that role. That's my goal. But before I get started, I want to ask another question, which is who in the group knows Jenny Doan? If I say the name Jenny Doan, does anybody leap up? Does anyone know who Jenny Doan is? Not a single person. It's pretty good. Okay, so there are no quilters in the group. Is that true? Is anyone a quilter? Okay, we have no quilters in the group. That's actually rare. Usually there's at least one quilter. If anyone's looking to get into a hobby, I would recommend quilting. But let me tell you a little bit about the story of Jenny Doan. And I'm going to use this to kick off my talk. One, because I like telling stories. And two, I think it's incredibly important to center every conversation we have about entrepreneurs with entrepreneurs at the center. So Jenny Doan and her husband lived in California. And Jenny her husband actually worked in a printing factory of some nature. And in 2000, or during the dot-com crisis and everything that sort of came afterwards, economic challenges, they both lost their jobs, her and her husband, and they decided they needed to move somewhere where it was maybe a little more economical to live than Northern California. And her husband suggested they move to the Midwest, to which Jenny replied, exactly whereabouts is that? Because she had never really been to the Midwest. And sight unseen, they moved to Hamilton, Missouri, which is a small town. It's about 45 minutes north of where I live in Kansas City, Missouri. They had, I believe 6 children. And when they moved, her husband was able to get a job at the Kansas City Star printing presses, the local or the regional newspaper. But they still found, economic challenges in paying for all the things and raising their kids. Jenny was a quilter, and she really enjoyed that as a hobby. And one day, her husband drove her into town to drop off a quilt to have it backed. I don't totally know what that means, but I think you put basically the covering on the back of a quilt. And when they picked it up, the person said it was $75. Her husband overheard that. When they got in the car, he said, "Honey, I really appreciate that you like quilting, but $75 is a lot of money for us to be spending when we don't have a ton of funds. Is there any way you could do that yourself and save the $75? And she said, well, in order to do that, I would need a sewing machine with an arm, a large arm, to be able to do the work. And so the family got together and had some discussions and decided that they would buy her collectively that sewing machine, and she could start a small quilting business in her small town. Instead of paying someone else $75, she could charge $75. I'm going to fast forward way through the story, but a couple key points is that in 2008, her children who were helping her start this business suggested that she do some product demos of the services that she provided on YouTube, which at the time was a new website. So she said, "Oh, great, what's that? YouTube." And in the first filming of the tutorial that she was putting together, she actually tripped over a light cord and broke her leg. So it didn't start out too well. Fast forward through a bunch of other plot points. I'm going to share a little bit more in just a second. The company she founded, the Missouri Star Quilting Company in Hamilton, Missouri, population 1,800, today in 2021 is the largest supplier of online quilting supplies in the world. But it started out with just a small idea. A family in need of income, funds, and a family coming together in a small town, rooting for each other. I'm going to share a short video just to kick this off with a little bit of Jenny's story. And again, the goal here is to root our conversation today in the stories of entrepreneurs. So let me switch over. I'm going to try this on YouTube, and hopefully this will work for us. And this plays because if you all could just give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear it.
My name is Jenny Doan, and I'm a quilter, and I'm a mother, and I'm a grandmother. 2008 was when all the markets crashed. We lost our retirement. Hamilton was losing hope, and my husband and I were losing hope.
My sister and I, we challenged ourselves to help figure out a way to help them. We found this building. It was an old auto showroom.
Our kids bought us a quilt machine.
Everything that's been made in here has been made by my own hands.
We were just a cute little shop, just like everybody else.
It was very humble beginnings. One day Al came in and asked me if I wanted to do tutorials, and I was like, sure, honey, what's a tutorial? I had not a clue.
YouTube gave us the opportunity to really differentiate. We got to 1,000 subscribers year one. And then the next year we got to 10,000 subscribers, 25, and then 50, and then now we're at 300,000 subscribers.
Hi everybody, I'm Jenny from the Missouri Star Quilt Company.
We started carrying all the fabrics that Mom would use in the tutorials.
Alan said, well, I think I'm gonna buy another one of these buildings and put that fabric in there because we need more room.
So now we're the world's largest provider of pre-cut quilting fabric.
We have the best employees ever. Over 200 people.
In the beginning, we were just shipping 10 orders a day.
Now we ship 5,000 orders a day.
Opening a business in Hamilton kind of sparked things.
We've got 14 quilt shops in town, 3 restaurants, a little hotel. It's this whole quilting Disneyland in Hamilton, Missouri. We had over 100,000 people come to Hamilton last year.
Oh, we love Jenny.
My whole life, I've always wanted to own a business, and none of that would be possible without the Missouri Star Quilt Company.
All I have to do is open my door and bake my goods, and Missouri Star does the rest.
YouTube has enabled my family and I to bring hope to the town and to the people who live here. So I got a letter from a lady who lived in Iran, and she ended her letter to me by saying, "You have filled my war-torn life with color." I just wept at my sewing machine, and Al came in and he's like, "Mom, are you okay?" And I said, "Al, I just thought I was sewing. I had no idea how huge this was." The growth of Missouri Star Quilt Company is the sweetest, most serendipitous thing that's ever happened to us.
If you find yourself near Hamilton, Missouri, I encourage you to go. There are something like 15 or 16 now quilting shops on what was once an empty Main Street. There's even a quilting shop. It's called I think they call it something like the Man Cave, and there's leather seats with chairs and remote controls and a bar. Not to say that men don't quilt, but it's one of my favorite features of Hamilton, Missouri. I share the story again of Jenny to just set our conversation today, thinking about the humans that we all help and the systems that we build to help those humans that have dreams and they have hopes and they have ideas. And the success of those individuals over their lifetime is not just independent on a good idea, as you all know, or the right amount of investment money. In fact, through our work at the Kauffman Foundation, what we've come to see and come to learn is that the environment in which these entrepreneurs live are one of the primary sort of prerequisites for the success of entrepreneurs. And so today, these environments, we call them entrepreneurial ecosystems. 5 years ago, we called them entrepreneurial communities. But today I want to talk a little bit about what we believe the Kauffman Foundation is a new approach or a sort of frame to think about how we help entrepreneurs in our communities, called entrepreneurial ecosystem building. I know some of you are super familiar with this. Some of you may be the nation's experts in it, but some of you might be new to it. So I want to set the frame a little bit just so we're using the same mental model for our conversations today when I talk about entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I'm going to tell you another brief story. So this is Maria. Maria is an entrepreneur. She has, like all entrepreneurs, a wonderful idea for a business, but she has 10,000 questions and lots of things that she doesn't know. So Maria, the fortunate thing for her is that within her community, there are tons of resources to help her. In her state, there are more resources in her region and across the country and really around the world to help her. And so Maria's job as an entrepreneur is very straightforward, but it's incredibly complex, which is that Maria's got to run around in the right order as quick as possible to answer her questions and find the resources she needs before she runs out of energy, money, hope, or her spouse says, it's time to get a real job, right? So as people who think a lot about entrepreneurs and how entrepreneurs succeed, we have a very straightforward job, but it's also incredibly complicated, which is there are many resources. Many of us, many of the folks on this call are responsible for some of those resources. They take many, many forms. Some are official resources that say entrepreneur in the title, and some are other resources that can help entrepreneurs, but maybe they don't generally put that in their title or are often seen as entrepreneurial support organizations. So our job as community leaders who want to try to create the environments to support entrepreneurs. Our job is to think about these resources and connect them together before Maria even shows up. And then we have to grease the skids, as I usually call it, which is the connection point between those resources. So that when Maria shows up, if my organization or one organization can't help Maria, they're quick to say, well, Maria, you know what? I don't actually have help with that, but you know who you need to talk to. You need to go talk to Martha over here. Or I can't refer you to someone who can specifically help you, but let's get some folks together to talk about your challenge and we'll figure out who has that solution. So this connection, these relationships, this network of people, as many of you know, is often referred to as an entrepreneurial ecosystem. But all the research says, if you dig into it, is innovation and ideas grow and foster in dense networks of people. But how do you grease the skids is always the question that people ask, right? How do you make those connections? And the surprising answer to some people is actually culture. So we believe that culture is one of the primary drivers of economic development in the connected age. What kind of culture are we talking about? Well, for those of you who work deeply in entrepreneurship and have felt its success, especially in your incubators, your accelerators in your town, you'll be able to, so you sort of probably can feel that the culture. And it's not one specific culture, but I'll define just some of the cultural elements that we find that are prevalent in communities that have thriving entrepreneurial ecosystems. Culture that says, dream big, grow here. Everyone is invited. Help each other. Open doors and listen. Give before you get. Pay it forward. Have more fun together. Trust, collaborate, experiment, take risks, fail, get back up, try again. We create here. These are just some of the cultural elements that are really foundational to successful entrepreneurial ecosystems. I spent the last 15 years of my life thinking about how do you build these ecosystems, as Martha mentioned, primarily in Iowa initially, and then that spread to communities around the country. And then I was invited to join the Kauffman Foundation, where I've also had the opportunity to travel internationally. And one thing that I know for certain is that entrepreneurial ecosystems can be built, sustained, and grown anywhere in the world. But it takes active and intentional work. They don't just, entrepreneurial ecosystems can't be bought. They have to be built, and they're built by human beings, just like folks on this call. And what I'm excited to talk to you all today and sit in and hear a little bit more of your conversations is that entrepreneurial ecosystem building is very much an emerging practice, by which I mean we're all sort of still trying to figure it out. And the only way we're going to figure that out is to do it together. And so the opportunity to learn from you all and what you are doing. There are very few states, I would say less than a half dozen that I'm aware of that have rooms like this. So you all in Maine are pioneering a new practice. And I hope that this is just the next step in what has been, I know, a journey in Maine to bring networks together, but I hope this is just the next step. Before we dive into a little bit more on entrepreneurial ecosystems, I want to show a short video that we put together at the Kauffman Foundation talking about ecosystem building and its emerging approach. It's a short video, and give me a second to switch screens and we'll give it a watch. All right, give me a thumbs up if you see this or if you hear this too. An entrepreneurial ecosystem is all of the resources that surround entrepreneurs as they move their business forward. Ecosystem building is about getting those resources and folks in the community to work together by creating an environment of trust and collaboration, supporting big ideas, supporting people when they take risks, supporting people when they fail, creating that right culture that is ripe for entrepreneurial success. Because of the changing nature of our economy and our communities, we have to take new approaches in ways that will make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate. Traditional ways of supporting entrepreneurs looked at the individual parts of an ecosystem. Ecosystem builders take a systems view. They put entrepreneurs front and center in that system, and they say, how can I make our community more supportive of entrepreneurs of all types? So the role of an ecosystem builder is really a systems leader. It really takes leaders stepping up who care about the whole system and not just the individual parts of the ecosystem. Entrepreneurial ecosystem builders come from economic development, community development, libraries, universities. They come from different sectors. They could be entrepreneurs themselves. Anyone who cares about the success of entrepreneurs in their community. The challenge is that there's thousands of people that are working on building their entrepreneurial ecosystem, but they were doing it in what I would call custom and bespoke ways. There's very little consensus on some basic elements. How do we create the environment in which entrepreneurs in our community can thrive? What are the processes? What are the steps? How do you build an ecosystem? How do you measure the health of an ecosystem? And I think as that practice of ecosystem building matures, it becomes more available to more communities. The only way we're going to figure out how to do this is to figure it out together. That video is also available online if anyone needs that, as it just we created it in a way for people to easily be able to describe what you all are doing. As we think about entrepreneurial ecosystems and think about Maria, we think about this story. Just even thinking about this graphic, I know a couple of themes that are really framing this today. I just have a couple of thoughts to share related to that. You know, when you think about an entrepreneurial ecosystem, one of the interesting things about it is there is no edge, there is no end. You can't always tell what's in an ecosystem and what's not in an ecosystem. As we think about the state-based architecture or networks that provide support in Maine, that's one layer of the ecosystem, but there are also individual and smaller networks that are being cultivated by many of you, maybe in your communities or in your county or different parts of the state. The thing is, if you think about Maria, Maria doesn't care where the resources are that help her or the person that can answer her questions. But our goal, if we care about the future of Maine and the future of our ecosystem, is to get Maria connected to whatever she needs right when she needs it, before, again, she runs out of time, money, energy, or effort. And so one of the key things, and one of the things I think you all are ahead of, is you're having gatherings like this, where folks who work in local communities are speaking with people who think on a statewide level and vice versa. Because the reality is not every community, not every town, not every county, not every state has all the resources you need to help every single entrepreneur. And so we need to build those networks before the Marias of the world show up. And then we need to make sure that those networks are inclusive and open to people that have often been left out of the conversation or out of the networks around entrepreneurship and economic development. I don't have to tell you that. I know you all wouldn't be here if that was not how you thought about this. And we'll dig a little bit more into it in terms of issues and opportunities and equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I want to sort of frame this back into a larger frame as we transition into the more conversational part of today. So people always ask, well, how do we create a culture if culture is the most important part of these ecosystems? Because the culture is the connectivity. What we've learned at the Kauffman Foundation, and what I know to be true of ecosystems and networks everywhere, is the magic in the ecosystem isn't in the individual parts. It's in the connections between those parts. And the connection between those parts are created and forged by human beings just like you. And so as we think about how do we support entrepreneurs in the state of Maine or in the region around Maine, here's one way to think about it. We've spent the last 20 or 30 years thinking about how to support entrepreneurs. And that's how we've thought about it for, on the left side, we've thought about for quite some time. More money, more technology, more training, more incubators, better policy. Those are 100% true, and we need those. But this approach of ecosystem building, or thinking about the entire system that helps entrepreneurs, requires us to think about the things on the right side: more community building, more social capital, more trust, more connectivity, more equity and inclusion, and more peer learning between not just entrepreneurs, but folks like you who support entrepreneurs on a daily basis. Now, why is that diversity, equity, and inclusion important? I mean, obviously, if the last 2 years has helped make this point abundantly clear. But another way to think about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion is that the demographics of the United States are drastically changing. The population of the United States, by the time we get to about 2055, will be a majority of people we currently refer to as minorities, or often heard called the new majority. And so what research shows us, those people have faced significant barriers to entrepreneurship, whether that's people of color, whether that's women, whether that's immigrants, whether that's people from rural communities. and all the other ways you can slice diversity in our communities. But the reality is what research shows is that if those people are not able to participate in our economy and entrepreneurship, through entrepreneurship, it has a significant impact on our local community, not just to the entrepreneurs who face those barriers, but it actually contributes to stagnant growth, the increase of the sort of wage and wealth gap, and a lot of other challenges. So in order to build a thriving community and economy in the 21st century, we have to make sure that our communities are inclusive of folks who, again, have often been left out of that conversation. We'll dig a little bit more into that in just a little bit. So how do you build entrepreneurial ecosystems? We know culture is incredibly important. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, entrepreneurial ecosystems, I said, they don't just grow, and you can't buy them, you have to build them. And that requires human beings who we often refer to as ecosystem builders. Many communities, many states, many regions have many elements of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, just like Maine. Maybe they're not connected, or they're nascent, or they're siloed from each other. And so what an ecosystem builder does is consider not just their individual organization, but how their organization sits within the larger system, sort of picking their head up and looking around. And ecosystem builders work to enhance each of the elements, but also to connect them together into the whole system, to support and wrap around the Marias of the world. Ecosystem builders help communities move from disconnected to connected. This works on many different levels, but as we talk about today, the actions we could all take as a group and individually think about what more can we do to take the state of Maine's entrepreneurial ecosystem and move it from disconnected to connected. So ecosystem builders, in doing that effort, they create invisible infrastructure. So it's not like traditional infrastructure. It's not about physical buildings or big pools of money. It's actually about creating consistent collaborative human engagement so that the Marias of the world can move quickly around the networks within our state and within our region to grow their entrepreneurial ideas. So like entrepreneurs, what we see from the national view at the Kauffman Foundation is ecosystem builders come in many forms. You don't need a fancy title or a big bucket of money to be an ecosystem builder. You actually just have to care enough about entrepreneurs in your community. And I don't think you'd be here at this gathering today if you didn't. One of the other things that I've learned in the last 5 years at the Kauffman Foundation, which is incredibly important, is no one individual organization can build an entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's not just Maggie and Anne and Martha's responsibility to build Maine's entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's all of our responsibilities because you need a lot of different skills. So ecosystem building really is a team sport. And whether you're thinking on a statewide level or a local level, if you're an entrepreneurial ecosystem builder, or you see yourself as an ecosystem builder, the first question to think about is who's standing next to you in that team. And we've got to build that team. But that's what it feels like this event is all about. So what steps should we take? These are a lot of questions we get. The biggest thing I would say, and the biggest lesson I've learned, it's the thing I say the most in my job, is if a culture of trust and collaboration is the driving force, it's the magic that animates an entrepreneurial ecosystem. I want to emphasize that you can't build trust and collaboration by talking about building trust and collaboration. You have to do something. So a lot of people, if you're in a meeting that's like, how are we going to trust and collaborate each other? Get out of that meeting because it's probably not going to work. You got to do something. But the thing that's cool is it doesn't even matter what you do as long as everyone in the group is excited to do it. So if y'all decide you want to build a statewide network of tech transfer offices and pools of capital, an incredibly complicated project, you could do that. But if you also all decide you just want to have a single place where people can go with a list of events in Maine, you could also decide, hey, you know what we used to call it in Iowa, margaritas and bowling. So sometimes when trust kind of waned and some friction came up in our groups, we always said is, well, we got to do some more margaritas and bowling, which simply means getting people out to get to know each other a little more. So I know we're going to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about what entrepreneurial ecosystem building could look like, or what more could be done to build the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Maine. But I want to share just 4 quick examples, and I actually have sort of briefs, written briefs that we can dig deeper into the stories if you're interested. I'm going to share the high-level story, and if you want to go deeper, I actually have multiple page briefs on each of these. So the first is an initiative in Minnesota. It's called Forge North. And Forge North wasn't created to be a new entrepreneurial support organization. It was created solely and specifically to say, what could we do together to support entrepreneurs in our community? They built a cross-sector regional coalition of leaders that meets on a regular basis, does assessments of the whole ecosystem, chooses direction for the ecosystem's focus on what they're going to improve. It's based out of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but it does work pretty regionally. It's an excellent example of using sort of a cross-sector model to leading an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the Kauffman Foundation has a bunch of resources. If you go to Kauffman.org, oops, I just realized that this is cut off, so I'm going to do this. I think you can see it now. If you go to Kauffman.org/ecosystems, there are some resources there. And we actually have a whole brief that really outlines the story of Forge North and what they did in Minneapolis. But that's a good example of not choosing to just do one thing, but actually creating a process in which they could continually, as a region, do work to intervene and build their entrepreneurial ecosystem. Many of you I know have been important and essential leaders in your entrepreneurial community during COVID as entrepreneurs face unprecedented challenges. We found a great story out of Mesa, Arizona, where a group of entrepreneurial support organizations came together to support entrepreneurs during COVID. With the PPP loans, people were running everywhere and organizations were overwhelmed and banks didn't know who to talk to. But rather than everyone just putting their head down and working as hard as they could, they decided to form a coalition. They built an online digital platform to support entrepreneurs first, to support them around the PPP loans, but eventually providing online education across many entrepreneurial support organizations. So not every organization had to produce their own video content. And that platform has actually lived on past the PPP loan program. It's called the Hub. That's the example. It's a pretty advanced program. But one of the key elements of their program is they saw that many entrepreneurs of color were not receiving PPP loans and not being able to apply because they didn't have access to bankers. So they partnered with the local chambers of commerce and other organizations that had cultural competencies with working in different communities of color that linked together with some of the larger state and city economic development organizations to be able to distribute information and create a stronger pipeline, not just at one organization, but across all the entrepreneurial support organizations in Mesa. A third example that we will be producing a brief action in a couple months on, but I wanted to just highlight it because it's actually really similar to the work that you all are doing, is an organization called Network Kansas, which exists in obviously the state of Kansas. It originally started with some funds from the state legislature, but they have built a statewide network of resources, including a statewide database of all the entrepreneurial support organization grants, et cetera, that is managed at a state level. And then they have something like 78 local communities they call e-communities that provide services directly to entrepreneurs within their network. But the individual community doesn't have to keep track of all of the resources across the state because the state network directly links into the local e-communities. And as an example, when the state of Kansas received some significant money from the Build Back Better plan, they were able to distribute it from the state level network into local communities within a month, multiple millions of dollars to local entrepreneurs who needed them. So Network Kansas is another good example of a statewide network. The last and final one I want to share with you, and then I promise I'll wrap up to take some questions and have some conversations, is some work going on in St. Louis. So we talked about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but similar to building entrepreneurial ecosystems, you can't just hope it happens. You have to take intentional efforts to change and adjust the structures of our communities to be more inclusive of folks. About, I think it was 5 years ago, a group of entrepreneurs actually founded the St. Louis Equity and Entrepreneurship Collective, which uses design thinking sprints and efforts to try to first assess where the barriers are in entrepreneurship for women and people of color, and then involving the network of, I think it's like 400 organizations and individuals that support entrepreneurs, take action across the city and the community to address systemic barriers. Again, it's less about, in this particular case, it's less about the mindsets of individuals, but actually shifting the systems itself through taking action together. Lots more there you can read about on their website, but one thing I do wanted to highlight is just one of the things to look at if you are interested in this particular model is the collective approaches. The collective has these 7 pillars that I think are incredibly important and would be universal for wherever you wanted to support entrepreneurs, especially those that are often underrepresented and left out of the conversation. And so again, it's not one individual organization saying we're going to do a better job to support Black entrepreneurs or women entrepreneurs. It's a collective of dozens of organizations saying, how can we not just work on our individual programs, but the system that supports entrepreneurship as a whole? There's some great examples and case studies of their pilot programs, and I would highly encourage you to dig a little bit more into their work. So that's just 4 examples of what entrepreneurial ecosystem building looks like in other states. It isn't the answer for exactly everything that you all want to do, but the idea here is simply to provide you with some food for thought as we move into some group conversations. As I wrap up, I just want to share our founder, Ewing Marion Kauffman, who was born poor in rural Missouri and died a billionaire in Kansas City, and more famously brought the Royals to town, has this quote, and I love it because I think it really sums up what we're talking about today. And he said, all the money in the world cannot solve problems unless we work together. And if we work together, there is no problem in the world that that can stop us as we seek to develop people to their highest human potential. Hopefully that was enough to get your brains going. I'll turn it back, I believe, over to Maggie or Martha for a little bit of conversation. Then I'm excited about small groups.
I think we're turning it over to Liz to help manage this Q&A time and discussion.
Hey, Andy, thank you so much. I just want to thank also Maggie and Ann for sort of initiating this, because there's just so much potential here, and we all agree and know that building a culture of innovation and collaboration and inclusivity is the direction that we want to go. And sometimes in conversations in the ecosystem, there's been tension between, well, is it really scalable businesses that will move us forward, or is it the local smaller thing, and can a local smaller thing grow into scalable, and what's the interaction between the two? And so that's really part of what we were excited about, to bring that conversation to the forefront today. And so I'm really excited about the story about the quilter, because that's something that up front doesn't look like, it's not a new technology per se, but clearly it made a huge difference in that community. And to know that that became the largest supplier in the world of its sort is so incredible. And so I'm just really excited to have that story as a kickoff. And part of what we were asking people to do today is use their noggins to think about, how do we build these different parts together that don't always seem to be the same thing and don't always seem to fit or need the same resources, but we know that we're all part of this community, and we know that there's so many cultural overlaps. So I'm really excited to have that as a kickoff. And
Can I say something in response to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the key things to remember is that no entrepreneur wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I'm an innovation-driven company. I'm a small business. Like, only people like us say things like that. That most entrepreneurs just get up in the morning trying to make their company work. And one of the stories I always think about is Mr. Kauffman. So Mr. Kauffman was a pharmaceutical sales rep. This is after World War II. And the first year on his job, he got paid by commission and made more money than the president. So they cut his commission in half. The second year, he made more money than the president. So they cut his sales territory in half. So he borrowed $5,000 and started a pharmaceutical company in his basement. He called it Ewing Marion, or he called it Marion Labs, because his name was Ewing Marion Kauffman. His middle name was Marion, because he didn't want people to know it was a one-man show. Years later, he sold the company for about $6 billion. It was one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies on the New York Stock Exchange in the 1990s. But when Mr. Kauffman borrowed $5,000 and started it in his basement and named it Marion Labs, he wasn't like, I'm going to build $1 billion company and be a high growth startup. Mr. Kauffman was just trying to get paid because he didn't like the sort of pay scheme of his previous employer. And so, yes, high growth entrepreneurs are incredibly important. And yes, the research says they create many of the new jobs, but small businesses, micro businesses, they all play a role. They're all part of the sort of the fertilizer, if you will, use the ecosystem analogy of the soil that creates the combination that helps things grow. And so one of the things that you all are ahead on is you're actually having this conversation, because in a lot of states, people who maybe are in one small business support networks or high growth tech-driven innovation networks just don't talk to each other, because the processes to support small businesses and high tech growth businesses are actually different in many ways. Innovation folks use the design, business model canvas. design thinking. Small businesses often use business model plans. And so one of the cool things that we're just even here having this conversation with folks that do both. And you never know when the Jenny Doan who buys, you know, a knitting sewing machine with the goal of like making a couple $100 becomes the Missouri Star Quilting Company. So just to reemphasize exactly what you said, Liz, I think it's incredibly important to recognize from an entrepreneur standpoint, that's not how they think. But we do need resources in our state and our communities to support entrepreneurs at all levels of entrepreneurship, but also at all stages of entrepreneurship too.
Great, thank you. Yeah, part of the conversation we've been having is how do we include more people wherever they are, and how do we encourage them to think big? Okay, great. So hands up. Please use your electronic hands since I can't see all the faces. Elisa O'Donnell.
Hi, thank you, Andy. That was really so fascinating and very inspiring, so greatly appreciate it. So my question is, given your experience in ecosystems, do you have any rules of thumbs or metrics that we should be considering, particularly when you talk about a dense network, you know, nodes to clusters, different types of entrepreneurs to support organizations? Are there anything?
Come on in.
I would say, you know, that's a great question. I would say I don't have a quick and fast 1, 2, 3, 4, but I will give you sort of, if you want a rule of thumb to think about. So entrepreneurial ecosystems are about the interaction of all the elements. Again, the magic of an entrepreneurial ecosystem is in the connection. So that's the, you know, 1 + 1 = 3. Like a great ecosystem can create things when everyone works together that one individual organization can't do alone. And we spend a lot of time measuring the things that are easy to count and that I often call the outputs. So jobs created, companies created, investments. Those are easy because you can count them. The things that are harder to measure are the things that happen before those outputs. So how organizations are connected, the social capital and trust between them, how organizations or entrepreneurs are able to move through a network to be able to find the resources they need. Obviously, it's easy to count the parts because they're there. But my suggestion and the things to continue to think about is how can we measure the connections across the network within the ecosystem. Now, you probably need some core-based metrics of just like how many entrepreneurs, but actually many states can't even answer that question, which is how many entrepreneurs are there in the state? But if you get too bogged down in how many accelerators or how many incubators or how many venture capital funds, you're missing the part about the connections. I will also say this. For a long time, the message has been more is better. So more accelerators is better, more incubators is better. But we're starting to see conversations happen where like the state of Iowa had no accelerators in 2015, and now it has 9. And so the question also for you all to have amongst yourself is, do we need more of everything? Or is there something we have so many of that we could probably bring together or consolidate? To help sort of the network as a whole provide that support, not just one individual organization.
Thank you. I'm waiting for more hands to go up, but in the meantime, Andy, I know there was an article that came out of Kauffman several years ago talking about IDE, innovation-driven enterprises versus small and medium businesses, and it sort of implied that more, like in order to lift an entire economy to the next level, you needed to focus on the IDEs sort of maybe more than the SMEs. And I was wondering if that thinking has developed since that paper, how Kauffman
Sure. I don't know specifically what paper you're referring to, so I won't address it directly, but I'll offer a larger sort of vantage point on that question. So one of the things to remember is that all of us at this table right now are doing whatever job or thing we've set out to do. Because entrepreneurial ecosystems require the support of many sectors, many different folks. We have folks in economic development, community development, and venture development. We have people in investors. We have co-working space owners. We have, you know, rural development. We have workforce development. I mean, it'd be interesting to actually look at who's in this group. The actual things that we all want are different. And one of those things is you get into conversations about what are we trying to do here. We have to really sit down and recognize that people want different things. So folks who work maybe in more traditional economic development, the primary measure is thinking about job growth. I worked in Iowa supporting entrepreneurs. I didn't work in economic development. The reason I was doing the work as an entrepreneur to start an incubator is I wanted there to be cool stuff in my community, and I wanted all my creative friends to be able to make their cool things. Some folks think about workforce development, so developing the talents of individuals in our community. And so the paper you may be reading and the thing you may be referring to is a significant piece of research that came out probably like 6 or 7 years ago that said it isn't actually the size of the company that creates jobs, but it is actually the age. And so that most net new jobs are created by companies 5 years old and younger. Depending on how you cut that, there's nuance that I don't want to get into right now because it'll open up a whole can of worms. But essentially, that young companies 5 years old and younger create a lot of the net new jobs, where big companies create jobs and destroy jobs, and in sort of net it's zero. And so again, there's people on this call. Their job is to support. Their goal is to get more jobs, and the research does point to job creation by young and new and high growth innovation-driven companies. But there are other benefits, and also 99% of jobs generally are in our communities are actually provided by small businesses. And again, in the aggregate, it's a much bigger number than the individual companies. So part of it is a larger discussion for everybody to have, which is why does this network exist? And back to the question we got earlier, which is what are the metrics we're using to consider why we are here and why this network exists.
Great, thank you. Devin, then Joe.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Andy. So my question is related to best practices related to rural ecosystem building in particular, since Maine has a somewhat unique challenge in New England, but certainly something that's applicable across the US with population density. So, and given that research shows that definitely the quality of connections and interactions, but also the quantity of those connections is going to help drive innovation. So wondering what kinds of best practices you've seen with rural ecosystem development in particular. Sure. And the sub bullet to that is there a best practice related to should we in Maine be thinking Maine is the ecosystem versus Bangor, Portland? What are the approaches you would suggest?
The answer to your last question is yes, and so you have to think.
Yeah, I figured that was coming.
On multiple levels, because there are reasons to think locally and there are reasons to think a little more regionally. First, I'll tell you the advantage that I have seen just observing in rural entrepreneurship. So rural communities have an outsized advantage because of their size being small. If connections, social capital, and trust are actually the driver of ecosystems, smaller communities can shift their culture with just a limited number of folks. Also, people know people, and I saw people from rural communities. I say, oh, everyone's in everyone's business, but that's actually helpful when you're an entrepreneur in many ways. So I would encourage folks to really recognize that if you're in a small community, you actually have an advantage, because trying to get everyone to work together in Chicago compared to working together in a small town, there's certainly an advantage to it. I think just generally speaking, I don't know, I'm not an expert on rural ecosystems, but one thing that I would say is you have to just sort of think more regionally because the density is small. But given the changing nature of the world and Zoom lately, I actually think there's an advantage. We've gained some ability to connect with each other over larger geographic distances. But I once had an entrepreneur I helped, and what he called it, he said, I live in a rural community. I choose to live in a rural community. I don't want to live in a big city. And the exchange for doing that is I have to have more windshield time. I was like, what is windshield time? And he's like, I have to make an effort to drive to other communities in my region, and sometimes the bigger cities, to make connections, to go to events, to participate in conferences, to make relationships that I need as an entrepreneur. And I always thought that was one of the simplest pieces of advice, but it also applies to entrepreneur support organizations as well. I know there's a lot of work. I know, we have a lot to take care of each day, but creating that windshield time, or we'll call it Zoom time in 2021 to reach out to other folks before you need those connections and to build those relationships is where I've seen a lot of people do sort of effective network building in rural communities. I will point to this organization called E2, which is based out of Kansas, led by a guy named Don Mackey, who some of you may know. They are a clearinghouse of information about rural entrepreneurial ecosystem building. They have a podcast talking specifically about how this works in rural communities and what they're saying. They have case studies. They have some really cool funding models. And then they also have a phone number you can call if you're like, I have a question about rural ecosystem building. And they oftentimes can point you to other folks who have similar challenges or connect you with experts that might be able to help you in some of your efforts.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Was someone? I was gonna say Joe, then Martha, if that's okay, Maggie. And then we got to move on to the next section. Okay. Joe, you're muted. You're still muted.
That seems like a microphone problem. Maybe jump to Martha so we can.
Martha and Joe, if you want to write your question in the chat, maybe we can still get to it. Go ahead, Martha.
I think I'm going to cede my time because I might open a can of worms. So I put my hand down.
Okay. Well, any thoughts that people want to put, even worm opening thoughts, maybe they could go in the chat and people can look at them and carry them into their small group conversations.
That sounds great. And I like that phrase, worm opening. I think we should keep that in mind. And we're going to hand it over to Ann, because as Andy said, the connection is the magic. So we want all of us to have some time together today too.
Can I wrap up with just one comment?
Yes.
So one of the fundamental questions in entrepreneurial ecosystem building, potentially the most fundamental, is this question that comes from the author Margaret Wheatley. And it's, how do you lead when no one's in charge? No one in this room is in charge of Maine's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Nobody's the mayor of the ecosystem. No one's the president or the CEO of the ecosystem. We're all just players within it. And all of us have a role to play in building the ecosystem and connecting it. And the behavior we do and things we model create the future of that ecosystem. And just recognizing that we all play a part, just like every animal and every plant in a rainforest ecosystem. And recognizing that your role and the actions you take affects the ecosystem every day, whether that's a positive or a negative thing. And so the challenge I really give to you is to think about over the next remainder of this call, what role do you want to play in the ecosystem? I'm not saying you have to make it your full-time job, but recognizing you have power and influence. And what you all are doing is a conversation that very few states are having. So I encourage you to keep at it, and I'm excited to see what you all build together.
Great, thanks, Andy. So we are going to break into small groups to give you a chance to connect with each other. It'd be great if you could have someone take some notes, and if they could email them to us ahead of time, that would be great. And in your groups, you're going to have 2 questions to answer. And I think, Maggie, you're going to put them in the chat, I believe. And the first one is, what's one thing we could do or create together that would make a difference in or strengthen Maine's entrepreneur ecosystem? And the second question is, what promises or pledges are you willing to make?
So we have about 13 minutes left. And I know, is Andy still with us? I can't tell.
He is.
Okay, great.
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
I just noticed with your Zoom, you can share files. I don't know if that's just, I'm going to share my slides and via that, and then we can just have them.
Oh, great.
That's fine. I'll capture them, Andy. Thanks.
Okay. So I just want to take a few minutes, before we wrap up, and thank everyone today, to just hear some of what you talked about in your small groups as you were reflecting on everything you heard from Andy, and hopefully connecting with folks in your group that were new to you and others that you already knew. So I'm just going to ask you to, I can't see everyone, so just go ahead and jump in if you have something to share from your group.
So this is Sarah Joy from DCD, and I am the Small Business Development Manager. And we talked a little bit about, we talked a lot about screen time or windshield time, and the commitment from folks to really reach out to others around the state to develop relationships. And then the other piece that we talked a little bit about is the state's resource of startup space, and how that is a work in progress, but it is a really robust tool that we are hoping to to create opportunities for people to connect through that space, but also to be aware of what is happening across sectors and across regions.
Great. Thanks, Sarah Joy.
Evan Rickert from Bangor, upstate Maine. We talked some about how to use MXG or other mechanisms to forge connections at the regional level, create regional hubs, and then forge connections, deep connections between those hubs to share resources, learning, entrepreneurs, and so forth.
Great. Thanks, Evan.
This is Gigi Guyton from New Ventures, Maine, and our group says that we have a lot of worker bees within the entrepreneurial ecosystem organizations, and we need to observe the leadership of those organizations working together to do better and to work together. It would help with community building, inclusion, and trust. So do the heads of all these organizations, we could start with MXG participants, for example. Do the heads of those organizations ever look at these questions that we've looked at today? Let's come up with some questions from the MXG participants and ask the organization heads questions like, how can we work together better? Does your organization play a role in building trust and building the ecosystem? How much time do you dedicate to it? And the objective is empowerment.
This is Zach Smesher. I apologize. I have an unstable connection, so I can't turn my video on, which is kind of ironic. The next thing I'm going to say is that we talked about how accessing some of the statewide resources with the more acceptance of Zoom has been a good thing. And then on a more regional, local level, we talked a lot about the Down East Innovation Network and how that might be a great model to adopt regionally in other parts of the state or elsewhere, in that it's kind of a free form and it provides that opportunity for face-to-face interaction without really an agenda. It puts people in a place to kind of figure out what could happen. And I think certainly, I don't consider Belfast to be Down East. Some people may, but I think there's an opportunity certainly in the Mid-Coast. Dave Gogel, who's on the call here, and I kind of regularly have this conversation. I think certainly it's an opportunity I think that could develop out of the Mid-Coast, where Knox and Waldo County are certainly more of a region than individual county. There's not really a line between the two, and there's certainly overlap. So yeah, apologize for the camera.
Count me in on that. Does anybody want to share, while we have some time, any promises or commitments that you shared in your groups?
Our group was really big on windshield time. We really like that phrase. That was like, wow. That was great. We had a lot of promises about that.
Our group talked about taking the pledge and reaching out to as individuals to support the businesses that we wanted to see thrive. There's Black Owned Maine has a pledge, but you can take a rural pledge too. Take the rides to. I learned that Skowhegan is one of 3 communities designated, along with Munson and Lisbon, for development.
We didn't quite get to finish this part of the conversation, but I started to say before we were brought back to the room that I certainly commit, and I think, and I know there are others on here who share this philosophy or ethic, but as we may, as individuals or individual organizations, have ideas about what we might want to contribute to the ecosystem, that we share that with ecosystem partners early in the building process of that idea, so that we are engaging and getting feedback rather than building in silos.
Early engagement, I love that.
can I chime in with a quick thought? Just as you're thinking about, what would you want to contribute and commit in this? Don't underestimate the power of an invitation. They're not that hard to extend. Maggie and Martha and Liz and Ann extended an invitation to you all. I probably other people too that I haven't met, and y'all came here, and then y'all have now had conversations about how we might all work together either individually as a group, and recognizing that conversations are actually the building blocks of change. That all great, amazing change happen from tiny, small conversations between people who care, and that an invitation doesn't cost you much. You all are probably, well, I hope, starting to do events again, or driving around the state, for business, and an invitation to a cup of coffee or an invitation to maybe stop by an event. People can always say no. That's totally fine, but it's not a big ask, just a small ask, which is to invite people. And who could you invite? And maybe to entrepreneurs to come to see your program, or people that are often left out of that conversation. But just understand the power of an invitation. It doesn't cost you much. It often can be built into work you're already doing, but it's very powerful because it creates the opportunity for those types of conversations that change things.
That's great, Andy. Thank you. And I did say this earlier in the chat, but I want everyone to know we will, unless you told us not to during your registration, we're going to share your contact information back out with this group. So anyone that you've seen here today that you'd like to extend an invitation to, you will certainly be able to do that with that list. Did anybody else like to share?
I think one thing that our group came up with that was a realization, or like perhaps reaffirming the importance of focusing on the small and medium-sized enterprises that are the backbones of so many communities, and that oftentimes get overlooked in funding opportunities and opportunities for development, and really helping them grow to be that, to their fullest potential.
I would guess even on the flip side, to add to that, is the network in general adjusting its language and how we talk about entrepreneurship, and being more vocal about using that language, about giving examples where people can see themselves in that entrepreneurial network. Because a lot of times in Maine, it feels as though we're talking about tech companies and people are like, that's not for me. So yeah, that's very important that we qualify what we're talking about when we're talking about entrepreneurship.
Definitely. Thank you, Adela. And I think that storytelling component is really helpful for all of us. We asked some of you during registration to let us know if you had stories to share related to our theme. So we'll share some of those back out with this group, or potentially ask folks to tell some of those stories in future events as we come together again. And I think the storytelling is really powerful, as we saw from Andy's time with us too. Other folks want to jump in?
Maggie, I see Joe's hand up again. I'm not sure if it's
We'll see if it's, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. And the whole world will hear us. It was what Jen talked about in our debrief coming out was, I want to try to articulate, and she did a great job, but it's just the bullet point is, when you don't have leadership amongst the, we call them, I think Village Cap, I got this for them, Martha, and I heard you guys, the ESOs, right? The Entrepreneur Service Organizations, which is like 80% of MXG membership. If the leadership of those don't, talk about, say, 3 common questions, just like Ann asked us today. What can you do what's the one thing you can do to work better together, closer together? I almost see it's like, how about if we suggested, the pledge I would take is, if we came up with some common questions, I'd try to help get some of the leadership of, 20 organizations in a room to say, how do your organizations, just what Jen said, which is, Is this a role you play on, ecosystem building? Are you network weavers? Oh, yes, we are. Great. Everyone will say that. But then when you ask, how much time do you dedicate, or how much of your percentage of, Martha's FTE, I'm looking at Martha because you're in the corner near me. What percentage of time do you have to do that? Because everybody does have there is a manufacturing aspect to all of our businesses, right? An order comes in, we deal with it, we resolve it, and we take care of the customer until another order comes in some ways oversimplifying. But I don't think the general bucket of organizations think about it that way. And we spend a lot of time talking about it, but I don't, if there was a pledge, it would be, hey, pledge every organization gives 10% of every employee's time to network weaving, making an introduction, because right now I do it. And I was given an example of, I know a company that I have in my portfolio who would really benefit from meeting this SaaS company out on the West Coast with somebody I used to work with. But it's going to take me 30 to 40 minutes to rekindle that dialogue with that person. I know, set up the invitation, get them together. And before you know it, there's, an hour and 45 minutes, but they'll come back and go, holy moly, he introduced me to so-and-so. And now they're in a different network. So there's just not time for that when you're like managing 60 accounts,
I think it's a great point, Joe. And I think the more that all of us who identify as ecosystem builders, that we build trust and relationships with each other through continued collaboration and conversation. And so certainly want to echo Jen's comment in the chat that this was a great conversation and way too short, which to me says that this was a little bit overdue and that there are more conversations to come, bringing us all together. So I think for my commitment, I will say that I will do my very best to make more of these conversations happen moving forward. And I just want to say a big thank you to Andy for spending a lot of time getting ready for today with us and spending a lot of time sharing what he's learned and some of the stories of the work at Kauffman and really giving us some inspiration for today. So Andy, thank you so much. And a big thank you, of course, to Martha and Anne and Liz for helping with today's conversation. This has been really great. We have a lot to share with you as follow-up. As I said, the contact information, please email us the notes from the small groups. And we will also send out the links to the videos and Andy's slides so that you'll all have that moving forward. But let this be the beginning of even more conversations that we have with each other and work that we do together.